Hey there guys, it's Obsidian Chill. Got another video for today. And before I get to the actual footage and commentary of the video, I wanted to kind of set it up because it is going to be a controversial topic. Not so much for me, but it's very controversial on the forums right now and everyone's talking about it. It somehow kind of started with I the Gemini conversation and then kind of went to the having a fourth slot on your artifacts and then kind of also went into artifact swapping. So the primary exemplar for this is the controller role. I mean, every role art swaps, that's not an issue, but the primary exemplar is going to be controller role. Right now you have 12 artifacts in front of you. All 12 of these artifacts are what the... I mean, don't get me wrong, you're not required to do this at all, but this is what endgame players and controllers are taking advantage of to be able to art swap. So the first artifact they're going to have on their core slot is going to be Bop Comlink. The reason why you want Bop Comlink is because it gives you that immediate ability Bird's Blitz, which sets up all 3 debuffs. The advantage of that is that also the move itself doesn't CC. So a prevailing issue in elite content is that the more a controller uses debuffs, which all have like a stun or knockdown or some kind of crowd control component to them, the more you do that, the ads become immune and then it becomes an issue for the tanks. So really, controllers have 2 options. One, you go Quantum, because Quantum has no CC on their main primary attacks or controller debuffs, or at least they have controller debuff options that have no CC attached to them. And if you don't want to go Quantum, then you use Bop Comlink. So I know this is going to be kind of contradicted to what I've mentioned in terms of like my buff troll guides and everything else and artifact guides. This is the exception because you're artifact swapping, so you're still being a buff troll, you're still being whatever else, but because you're continually swapping these artifacts. So the second one is going to be the actual core component, Amulet of Ra. You're always running that regardless. Have that on. And then the third slot is what is being swapped. So usually you'd start with a cog because then at least gives the most DPS nowadays are precs. So you'd start with the largest buff first. So the thing with artifact swapping is that all of these effects can be active at the same time, or at least in the rotation. So you'd have Bop, you'd hit, Bird's Blitz. All of a sudden, that's going to immediately proc Amulet of Ra. Then you go into Cogamageddon and set up the cross weapon combo. Once you've done that, you can immediately swap into your inventory and put Tetron, for example, hit a Might Power or any kind of move that's gonna set up the Might buff. Then you've got 12 seconds right away for the cog. You've got the cog buff ticking for 12 seconds and the Tetra buff ticking for 12 seconds at that point. Then you can swap in Parasite Power Harness, which the 3 debuffs are active. Then you get the increased power pool, and then the precision DPS get like 1,000 to 2,000 extra prec at this point. At that point, also you can swap in Claw at that point. That sets up the buff for everyone. Same thing, that's a 12-second buff. Then every time, then you can set up Rings of Azar, which sets up the health buff for everyone. So that's increasing the damage from Tetra and Cog because of the health buff from Rings. Then you're swapping in Scrap before you use the Supercharge for the cooldown reduction. And then you're swapping in Eye of the Gemini possibly as well to set up your Supercharge. If you want to do that instead, because then at least that gives if you're using Eye of the Gemini as a controller, that might be a little bit extra, but I mean, same thing. Technically, you can use it to proc the Pollux Gaze for DPS, so the DPS are getting the 5% prec and might increase. You're swapping in Clarion just for the extra shield, because the controller shields are pretty much useless, so you can proc Clarion, at least for the extra 4 players. Then you're swapping in Dead King when you're using Orbital Strike, so you can also set up a cooldown reduction on the rest of your henchmen or pet trinkets. And then you're swapping in Philosopher's Stone every time you use a Supply Drop for those extra effects. So in the following footage, you're going to see most of that taking place. Essentially, it works out to every single time that you do like a Hand Blaster, like Soil Flare, Brawling Shuriken Storm, something set up because you need the cross weapon combo. So basically, between every Brawling Shuriken Storm, you're opening up your inventory and swapping an artifact. So this is impractical for PS4. They can do it, but it's impractical. PS5 works out great because the way it works on consoles is that when you open your inventory, it's automatically selecting the first slot. So that's why you can easily go, right, left, down, whatever you want. PC, you can hot swap the first slot, but then it's up to you. Basically, if you want to switch in multiple arts, then it's basically open up your inventory, moving your mouse. That's a lot easier if you don't have dual monitors, because with my dual monitor, when I put up my inventory, my cursor is going to be anywhere. So my cursor could be on my left side monitor, and then I'm not actually seeing that. Which, I mean, technically PC can artifacts technically the fastest, but then that's kind of like optimal setup. So like single monitor, you know exactly where your cursor is at all time, or have the cursor kind of staying around the inventory swaps, and then you're selecting that out. So that's what you're going to see. I'm going to touch them on my actual opinions in the commentary. I just wanted to say why the players were using all 12 of these artifacts basically in cycle and what it does. So without further ado, let's get touching the footage. It's being provided by Karaoke, and his channel link is in the description. So I just want to kind of briefly cover the other 2 points people are up in arms about in the forums. Surrounding getting a 4th artifact slot, whether or not we should, whether or not that's healthy for the game. Personally, I don't feel like it's going to be healthy for the game. The balance issues alone that would create, having 4 artifact slots. Even people are talking about strip the stats away from the 4 slot and just have the abilities. I mean, the stats aren't what break artifacts. It's the actual abilities. And if people are complaining about artifact swapping, you know, that's just going to become more compounded with 4th artifact slots, because then you can have a fixed 3 and then swap your 4th. So I wouldn't say it's impossible. I would say it's implausible for the future for us to get a 4th artifact slot. But just the balance issues alone would be crazy. Multiple artifacts have to be reworked. Synergies couldn't work with each other. I mean, it's not worth the headache just for an extra slot. Now, the second point was that artifacts should be locked and not be able to be swapped. That one I don't understand either. I mean, at the same time, you got to think about it. We have 41 artifacts from, I think, artifacts came out like 2018. So, I mean, in 4 years, we have 41 artifacts. Do you think they're going to lock you into 3 just because people are upset about artifact swapping, or the concept of artifact swapping, or they think artifact swapping is broken? That's, you know, that I don't see kind of any merit to that kind of conversation. You know, it's just not, locking artifact slots is not something they're going to do, because that is a huge revenue loss. I mean, there's no point to even try to get other kind of artifacts, either for your support roles or for your DPS roles, if you know you're only be fixed to 3. It would, you know, the meta is not that. And you have artifacts, for example, like Dead King Scepter and Philosopher's Stone, which are not strong enough to be kept on your main bar. Those are pretty much designed to be artifact swaps. So the main point of the video is going to be the whole concept around artifact swapping. All of a sudden it's kind of come up in the forums. I know it's kind of tied into the Eye of the Gemini discussion, so people have talked about Eye of the Gemini, and then that's kind of led into artifact swapping conversation. Now for me, there's different tiers of artifact swapping. So it's, like I said before, the prevalent exemplar is going to be the Troller role. But I mean, at the same time, you know, a DPS is going to have the most common meta is going to be either like Transstrat Solar or Transstrat Gemini, depending on if you're Prekka Might. Now, without artifact swapping, you limit yourself so much. Like Eye of the Gemini, yes, that's completely broken. That needs to change. But even if that would change in the future, you still can swap in Philosophers. You can still swap in, you know, Amulet. You know, Strategist card's not going to be perfect for every kind of situation. You know, there's different artifacts that are going to be helpful that will allow you to swap in. Yes, and I also understand the fact that artifact swapping is tied somewhat to your technology. You can swap on a PS4, but it's not practical to do this kind of swapping, obviously. And even like the Prekka swapping, where they do scrap a Soul Cloak before every supercharge. I mean, that's still a swap every 12 seconds, because you're with enough Jeb spam, Gadget's Prekka getting a supercharge off stealth each time. So that's basically a artifact swap you have to do every 12 seconds. So I can see on the PS4 that not being practical. I mean, PC it works, PS5 it works. So definitely going into the future. Because, I mean, I don't think PS4 support is going to be around forever, just like PS3 left. Eventually PS4 support's going to go, and then it's going to be in the next-gen consoles. I can't speak to Xbox. I mean, obviously you can't artifact swap on the Switch, that's for sure. But I can't speak to what Xbox is like for artifact swapping. I'm sure people have mentioned it before to me. I just can't remember off the top of my head. So what I can't see is I don't see an issue. It's really on you as the player. Like, if I was controlling, because I mean, I've been a main controller for multiple years in this game, would I go to this extent like Karaoke's doing? No. Personally, I wouldn't. But I can understand the perspective because A, he leveled the artifacts. Why not use them if you've leveled them? And B, technically all the stuff he's doing is benefiting the group. It's not doing needlessly swaps. Rings is buffing everyone's health, and then the buffed health is feeding into Tetra and Cog, and then he's doing the buff Comlink to feed into normally some extra power return for the Claw buff. Because, all these buffs you don't have to have active. Tetra and Cog, like I said, Tetra and Cog will last for 12 seconds. The Claw buff lasts for 12 seconds. So it's just how artifacts are designed. So they would have to fundamentally change how the artifacts function for them to impact kind of artifact swapping. At the same time, I agree that people shouldn't be like ostracized or left out of groups if they're not going to do this level of artifact swapping. But really, I've never seen an example of a situation where people have been outcast because they're not going to do this level of swapping. Most likely, groups nowadays just expect you to do one single swap, which is just Cog and Tetra. So you have Amulet, you have Claw, and then Cog Tetra. That's the common buff one. And even that's not too bad. Swapping one artifact every 12 seconds, that's doable. Same thing. If you don't want to do that, that's perfectly viable. That's your choice. It's artifact swapping is not going to get to the point where it's like a Gemini where you're excluded from groups if you don't have like multiple Gemini healers, or you're not going to see like art swap troll looking for group or something like that. You're not going to see that in LFG. It's not that extent, and it won't be. Obviously there's a huge paywall behind it in terms of leveling multiple, 10, 200 artifacts. But at the same time, if you're going to have those artifacts and pay for those leveling or the XP or the catalysts, why not be able to use them? So yes, it does create an imbalance in the fact where if you don't artifact swap as a player, then yes, you could be potentially behind. As a controller, obviously that's not going to impact you. Same thing. As a healer, I wouldn't risk it. As a tank, sometimes I've artifact swapped as a tank, usually just for Gemini, but largely it's sometimes it's not worth the risk. Even as a troller, it may not be necessarily worth the risk. But at the same time, there's no way no one has the right to kind of dictate what a player can and can't do. If a controller is constantly artifact swapping and dying because he's in his inventory, then yeah, either you kick him or tell him cut it down. But if somebody can pull off the artifact swaps while not still being able to get pickups and still be able to do his role, then I don't see an issue with it, and I don't see why other people see an issue with it. The whole concept where the DPS artifact swapping on balancing, that's artifacts itself. That's an issue with Eye of the Gemini, which I've talked about in other videos. If Eye of the Gemini was reduced or corrected, then the DPS art swapping may not be as impactful. But at this point, all the power to the player. So we can kind of continue the conversation in the comment section. I know mostly on the forums it's controversial, but I don't see that point. I can see both sides, but I don't see where the huge controversy is.